The Dead Man's Switch. Gavin Knight had always been fascinated with relics, strange devices, and especially things that held secrets. His house was practically a museum of antiques and oddities. Clocks that only chimed at midnight, Victorian-era cameras with cracked lenses, and ancient coins that supposedly held curses. But it wasn't until he received a small metal box from an estate auction that he felt something different, something darker. The box was inconspicuous, a simple black cube with tarnished corners, no more than 6 inches on each side. The auction catalog had called it a dead man's switch, found among the effects of a reclusive scientist named Dr. Alaric Heller. Dr. Heller had been obsessed with the idea of other realms and ancient entities, but he died alone and disgraced, his reputation ruined. Most thought his work was nonsense, the ramblings of a madman. Gavin, though, felt intrigue, almost compelled. The night Gavin brought it home, he set the box on his dining room table and just stared at it. Its edges seemed sharper in the dim light, the metal casting strange shadows that moved in ways they shouldn't. He saw the faint outline of a switch on one side, a small, almost invisible lever that seemed untouched. He ran his fingers over it, feeling a thrill course through him. When he turned the switch, there was a sudden click, followed by an eerie silence that filled the room. He expected gears to whir or lights to blink, but instead, the box remained still. Yet, as he held it, a cold chill seeped through his skin, and he suddenly felt as though he wasn't alone. For days, Gavin kept the box close, but it soon became apparent that something had changed within him since he flipped that switch. The box had been a trigger, like it had opened a door he hadn't realized existed. That night, he began to hear things. Faint whispers at first, growing louder each time he tried to ignore them. They were voices, barely perceptible, speaking words he couldn't quite understand, but that felt ancient, guttural, and malevolent. In the following days, he noticed shadows that didn't belong, movements just beyond the corners of his vision. Every night, a strange heaviness settled over him, pressing on his chest as he lay in bed, rendering him unable to move. He couldn't sleep, couldn't escape the feeling that he was being watched. Then came the incident with his friend, Martin. Martin had been Gavin's closest friend, the one who'd always humored his strange hobbies. But when he came over one evening and spotted the box, his face paled. "Where did you get this?" Martin asked, his voice barely a whisper as he pointed to the switch box on the table. "Estate sale," Gavin replied casually, not understanding his friend's sudden apprehension. Martin shook his head. "I read about these things once. It's supposed to be a dead man's switch. The theory is if someone activates it, it releases something dangerous. It's like a doorway to another place." Gavin scoffed, trying to brush off Martin's fear. But he felt his stomach twist, a sense of dread creeping in as his friend stared at the box. "I flipped the switch already," Gavin admitted, and Martin's face drained of color. You already activated it?" he stammered, voice trembling. He backed away, his eyes wide with terror. "You have to get rid of it, Gavin. Throw it away, destroy it, anything, before it's too late." But by then, Gavin could feel the weight in the room grow heavier, as though something were pressing in from all sides. He brushed Martin off, but he knew the advice was wise. That night, he took the box into the woods, miles from his house, and buried it deep in the ground, hoping to put an end to the strange happenings. He walked back home, feeling slightly relieved, thinking he'd left whatever curse the box carried far behind. But the voices only grew louder. 2 nights later, Gavin awoke to the sound of scratching, thin, sharp, and unrelenting, coming from the walls around his bed. The sound was maddening, a high-pitched scrape that sent shivers down his spine. He flipped on the lights, only to find deep, jagged scratches along the walls, as if something had been clawing to get in. Panic rose as he realized that the box hadn't stayed buried. He could feel its presence, lurking in the shadows, taunting him with every flicker of his vision. And the voices. They were no longer faint murmurs. They were chanting now, in a rhythm that seemed to pulse with a sinister energy. Desperate, Gavin called Martin, but no one answered. Feeling the cold grip of fear tightening, he drove to Martin's house in the dead of night. He found the door unlocked and the house eerily silent, as if all sound had been sucked from the air. He ventured into the living room, only to find Martin sitting on the couch, his face frozen in a rictus of terror, his eyes wide open yet lifeless. Gavin's stomach dropped as he noticed Martin's hand, still pointing to a single word scrawled in blood on the wall: run. Gavin didn't go home after that. Instead, he drove aimlessly, his mind racing, his heart pounding. The box had unleashed something, a force he couldn't comprehend, something bound him now, drawn to him like a moth to flame. He was its vessel, its door, and no amount of distance would free him. The following days blurred into one long nightmare. Wherever he went, he felt it lurking in the shadows. It would tap on windows, whisper his name, or leave marks, dark, shadowy handprints that faded like smoke when he looked at them directly. Sleep became a fleeting memory, and he could feel his sanity slipping. One evening, exhausted and at his breaking point, Gavin found himself back in his house. He stumbled into his bedroom and saw something that made his blood run cold. The box was there, sitting neatly on his bedside table, as if it had never left. But now, its edges were sharper, darker, and a faint glow pulsed from within, like the heartbeat of something alive. Unable to resist, he reached out and opened it. Inside was a note, scrawled in the same blood-red ink that Martin had used. It read, "There is no escape." From that night on, Gavin became a ghost of his former self. His friends stopped seeing him, his family heard nothing, and neighbors only caught glimpses of him through darkened windows. No one knew the true horror he faced each night, the endless torment that came with the activation of the dead man's switch. And in the end, it was as if Gavin Knight had never existed at all. His house stood empty, gathering dust, and the police found no trace of him. Only the box remained, waiting silently for the next curious soul to flip its switch and invite the darkness in. Years passed, and the story of Gavin Knight became a whisper, a cautionary tale. People who dared to look through his windows claimed they saw shadows moving, heard faint whispers, and some even swore they saw the box, gleaming darkly on a table. The dead man's switch was still active, still open, waiting patiently for another to dare and unleash what it held. Because as everyone knows, there are always those foolish enough to tamper with doors best left closed. And once opened, some doors never close again.